Ethan sat by the window of his quiet apartment, watching the city dissolve into evening. The lights outside blurred through the rain-streaked glass, casting faint patterns on the wooden floor. To anyone else, he was a man who had it all: a stable job, a loving wife, and a neatly organized life. But inside, Ethan felt like an actor trapped in a role that no longer fit. His marriage to Rachel had long been defined by silence rather than conversation. She was kind, patient, and devoted, yet their connection had dimmed over the years. What began as shared laughter had become polite exchanges at breakfast. She still reached for his hand at dinner, but the warmth between them was faint, like an ember refusing to die but no longer giving light. At work, things were different. The firm had recently hired a new freelance designer named Liam, and with him came a kind of energy Ethan hadn't felt in years. Liam was everything Ethan was not: free-spirited, expressive, and unafraid to be himself. His presence filled the office like a melody that refused to be ignored. Ethan told himself that it was admiration, maybe envy, nothing more. Yet every time Liam smiled, something inside him stirred that he couldn't name. They began collaborating closely on a marketing campaign. Long hours blurred into late nights, and what started as work discussions became quiet conversations about life, art, and dreams. Liam talked about his childhood, his love for painting, and how hard it had been growing up gay in a small town. Ethan listened with quiet fascination, drawn not just to his words but to the courage behind them. "I envy that," Ethan admitted one night as they packed up their laptops. "Being able to live without hiding." Liam chuckled softly. "It's not easy," he said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "But pretending is worse." Those words lingered long after Liam left. Pretending, that was what Ethan had been doing for as long as he could remember. Every smile at family gatherings, every casual kiss on Rachel's cheek, every assurance that he was fine, all of it had been a carefully rehearsed at home that evening. Rachel noticed the distant look in his eyes. "Rough day?" she asked, setting dinner on the table. Ethan nodded, forcing a smile. "Just work." But even as they ate, his mind drifted to Liam's laughter, the way it sounded unrestrained and real. That night, when Rachel reached for him, Ethan turned away, mumbling that he was tired. She didn't press. She had learned to accept the walls he built. Days turned into weeks. Ethan found himself looking forward to work more than home, to the easy conversations that made him forget the constant weight of expectation. One evening, after everyone else had left the office, Liam stayed behind to finish some edits. Ethan lingered too, though he told himself it was to check reports. When the clock struck 9, Liam leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You should head home. Rachel's probably waiting." Ethan hesitated. The air between them felt charged, fragile. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. Liam turned, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Sure." Ethan's throat tightened. The words came out before he could stop them, trembling, impulsive, raw. "Would you spend one night with me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Liam blinked, then laughed softly, not cruelly, but with a hint of disbelief. "Ethan," he said gently, "you're married. And I don't want to be someone's mistake." Ethan's face flushed. "It's not like that," he whispered. I don't know who I am anymore." Liam's expression softened. He reached out, placing a steady hand on Ethan's arm. "Then find out. But don't use me to escape your truth." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. The sound of rain against the windows filled the silence between them. Liam stood, picked up his bag, and offered a faint, almost bittersweet smile. "Good night, Ethan," he said, then walked out into the rain. Ethan remained frozen in place, his heart pounding with regret and confusion. Through the glass, he watched Liam disappear down the street, the glow of streetlights tracing his silhouette until it vanished into darkness. Alone in the office, Ethan whispered the words that Liam would never hear: "I just wanted to feel real, even for a moment." He turned off the lights and left, his reflection faint in the glass, a man caught between two lives, unable to belong fully to either, and though he didn't know it yet, Liam's quiet refusal had just begun to unravel everything Ethan thought he understood about love, loyalty, and himself. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Adrian and I grew inseparable, our doors swinging open as though hinges no longer mattered. Meals were shared, study notes exchanged, and the silence of midnight hours filled with conversations that left us more entangled than either of us dared to admit. The hostel had hundreds of boys, yet it often felt like Adrian and I lived in a world apart, divided from the rest by invisible walls, but beneath the comfort of routine, unease grew. I caught myself watching him too long, memorizing the curve of his smile or the sound of his laughter. Each glance carried a weight I could no longer deny. And though I told myself to step back, to reclaim the distance we had so easily discarded, I found it impossible. Adrian had become a gravitational pull, and I was helplessly caught in his orbit. The conflict within me sharpened whenever Michael's name appeared. Adrian would occasionally mention him, never with enthusiasm, never with the warmth I expected from someone speaking of love. Once, when his phone rang during dinner, I noticed the name glowing on his screen. He silenced it, muttering something about bad timing, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. I said nothing, but my chest tightened with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Why was he ignoring the man he claimed to love? One evening, we lingered in my room long after most lights in the hostel had gone dark. Our books lay forgotten on the desk, and we sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking in low tones. Adrian confessed that he often felt misunderstood, that Michael expected things from him he could not always give. His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. I wanted to comfort him, to say something meaningful, but all I managed was silence. In that silence, I realized my role was shifting. I was no longer just his friend. I was becoming his confidant, the one who knew the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. Guilt gnawed at me. I should have set boundaries, should have reminded him of the man waiting for him elsewhere. Yet the truth was crueler. I didn't want to. I wanted to be the one he turned to, the one who filled the void Michael seemed unable to reach. Each word he spoke deepened my longing and eroded my resolve. The night of confession came quietly, almost tenderly. We had been arguing over something trivial, whether he should reconcile with Michael or demand more honesty from him. I had spoken with unusual sharpness, frustration boiling over, not at Michael but at the invisible tether that bound Adrian away from me. He fell silent, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. And then, without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against mine. The kiss was brief but electric, shattering the fragile wall I had clung to for weeks. When he pulled away, the air between us seemed charged, the silence deafening. My heart pounded as I searched his face for regret, but all I saw was confusion, confusion that mirrored my own. We sat there, eyes locked, caught between desire and dread. Neither of us spoke of it the next day. Yet the current between us had shifted irreversibly. Every word, every gesture carried the echo of that moment. And though we tried to pretend otherwise, the truth hovered like a storm cloud. We had crossed a line. That night, Adrian returned to my room. There were no excuses this time, no pretense of study or conversation. He closed the door softly behind him, and in the quiet that followed, we gave in to what we had both been resisting. The weight of secrecy pressed down on me even as I felt the exhilaration of closeness I had long imagined. It was everything I had wanted, and everything I feared. When dawn broke, the world outside continued as though nothing had changed. Boys shouted in the corridor, breakfast smells drifted from the mess hall, and life resumed its predictable rhythm. But for me, nothing was the same. I lay awake long after Adrian slipped back into his own room, replaying every detail, every breath. The thrill was intoxicating, but beneath it lurked a shadow I could not ignore, that we had betrayed someone who trusted him, someone who deserved honesty. I had stepped willingly into the role of the intruder, the secret. The thought should have filled me with shame, but instead, it left me torn, between guilt and the dangerous sweetness of having what I had silently desired. And as I stared at the ceiling, I knew with painful clarity, the path ahead would not be simple. What had begun with a knock on the door had become something neither of us could control. Weeks turned into months, and the silence between Daniel and Michael hardened into something unmovable. Michael remained with his friend, and though they exchanged the occasional message about bills or belongings, their conversations were stripped of intimacy. Daniel lived in the shell of their shared home, surrounded by memories that cut deeper than knives. The quiet was unbearable, yet it forced him to confront the choices that had brought him here. He thought often of Adrian, but not with longing anymore. Instead, Adrian became a symbol, of desire unchecked, of validation sought in the wrong places. When Daniel closed his eyes, he remembered Adrian's gaze, the thrill of being seen. But now he recognized it for what it was, fleeting attention, not the enduring love he had once shared with Michael. The realization was painful, like waking from a dream only to find the room around you dark and empty. Daniel began to rebuild in small ways. He filled his evenings with long walks through the city, letting the rhythm of his footsteps calm the turmoil inside. He returned to hobbies he had neglected, reading, sketching, listening to music that reminded him of better times. These rituals did not erase his guilt, but they gave him structure, a way to keep moving forward when grief threatened to paralyze him. Friends noticed his change. Some offered comfort, others judged him harshly. Daniel accepted both. He no longer had the luxury of pretending his life was untouched. He had betrayed someone who trusted him, and there was no erasing that truth. The only choice left was whether he would learn from it or allow it to define him forever. One evening, Michael agreed to meet for coffee. It was their first real conversation since the confession. Sitting across the table, Daniel was struck by how familiar yet distant Michael looked. The man who had once been his anchor now felt like a stranger across a gulf Daniel had created with his own hands. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Michael said quietly, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup between them. "But I wanted to hear you explain why." Daniel's throat tightened. He searched for the right words, but none could fully capture the storm inside him. "I felt invisible," he admitted. "I wanted to be seen, to feel alive again. But I chose the worst way possible. I know that doesn't excuse it. I wish I had spoken to you instead of running away." Michael listened, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he said, "You didn't just break us, you broke me. And I don't know if either of us can go back to who we were." The words settled heavily between them. Daniel nodded, accepting them like a sentence. He knew reconciliation was not guaranteed, perhaps not even possible. But the conversation itself was a step, a painful, necessary acknowledgement of the damage done. Later that night, alone again, Daniel wrote in a journal for the first time in years. His words were clumsy at first, but soon they flowed, confessions, regrets, realizations. He wrote about the curtain in the exam room, how it had felt like a shield at the time, but in truth, it had been a barrier between honesty and deception. He wrote about Michael's grief, about the way betrayal spreads like cracks in glass, small at first, but unstoppable once begun. In those pages, Daniel began to see himself clearly, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man who had chosen wrongly and now had to live with the consequences. And in that clarity, there was a flicker of hope, not for redemption in Michael's eyes, but for growth within his own. The story did not end neatly, and Daniel knew it never would. But as he closed the journal and set it on his nightstand, he whispered to himself the one truth he had earned through pain: desire may blind us, but betrayal teaches us to see. And with that, Daniel turned off the light, stepping into a future uncertain, but more honest than the life he. Ethan woke one morning to the soft hum of the city outside his new apartment. It was strange how quickly silence had become a companion rather than an enemy. The air felt different here, lighter, unburdened. He made coffee and stood by the window, letting the morning light spill over the bare walls. This was the first place he'd ever lived that didn't carry anyone else's expectations. It was both terrifying and liberating. His days followed no script now. Without Rachel's quiet presence or Liam's vivid energy, he learned to sit with himself, to listen rather than run. He started walking every evening through the park nearby, where the trees whispered in the wind and strangers passed without knowing his story. For years, he had feared solitude, believing it would expose the emptiness inside him. But now, in solitude, he found clarity.at work, people noticed a subtle change. Ethan still spoke softly, still dressed neatly, still carried himself with the same professionalism, yet there was a calmness to him that hadn't been there before. When someone cracked a joke, he laughed easily. When a colleague mentioned a new designer joining the team, Ethan smiled faintly but didn't ask questions. He had learned that not every connection was meant to last, and that some people arrive only to awaken a truth before leaving. One evening, while organizing old files, Ethan found a photograph from the campaign he and Liam had worked on. The image was simple, a product ad, nothing special, but behind it were the memories of every late-night conversation, every moment of quiet understanding. He set the photo aside and wrote a small note beneath it, "To the one who reminded me to live honestly." Then he placed it in his journal and closed the book. Meanwhile, Rachel had started her own journey. She sent Ethan occasional updates, short messages about the places she was visiting, the new people she met, the courage it took to start over. There was no resentment in her words, only peace. In one message she wrote, "Maybe we were meant to teach each other how to stop pretending." Ethan read that line several times, realizing how much love could exist even after endings. Life, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to carry it without letting it define you. Ethan began volunteering at a local community center that supported young people struggling with identity. He never shared his full story, but he listened, really listened, as they spoke about confusion, fear, and the desperate need to belong. Every conversation reminded him of how far he had come, and how many still lived behind the same walls he once built. One afternoon, after a long day at the center, Ethan walked down to the river, the same one where he'd last seen Liam. The air smelled of rain again, and the water shimmered with the same restless light. For a moment, he imagined Liam standing beside him, smiling the way he always did when the world felt heavy. Ethan didn't feel sadness this time. He felt gratitude. He took out his phone and opened a blank message, typing a few words. "I'm okay now. Thank you for showing me who I was afraid to be." He never sent it. Instead, he saved it in his drafts, like a quiet conversation between two souls that didn't need to be spoken aloud. As evening settled, the city lights began to flicker across the river's surface. Ethan sat on a bench, his reflection merging with the glow. For the first time, he wasn't haunted by what could have been. He was content with what was, a truth that had cost him everything familiar but had given him everything real. When he finally stood to leave, he glanced back at the river one last time and whispered, "Freedom doesn't begin when you run away. It begins when you stop hiding." The wind carried the words away, soft and certain. Ethan walked home through the quiet streets, his footsteps steady, his heart unburdened. The night no longer felt heavy. It felt endless, full of new beginnings waiting quietly, like unopened doors that he didn't know what the future held, love, solitude, or something entirely unexpected, but he no longer feared it. For once in his life, Ethan wasn't searching for someone else to make him feel alive. He already was, and that, he realized, was the truest kind of freedom.